Sometimes in the news, someone being interviewed states an opinion, a viewpoint. And you might think, well, that can't really be fact-checked. That's their view. But so often, these opinions are actually crucial opportunities to fact-check. The only way to fix a problem is to deal with reality. When people express views, the news business should be sure to take the opportunity to tell you the reality. What we'll look at today on They Stand Corrected speaks to this. This is the second part of a two-parter in which I'm breaking down a disastrous interview that Joy Reid on MSNBC conducted with Queen Rania of Jordan, based on a request from a listener. The interview was filled with lies, and it was also filled with missed opportunities to give you new information that could transform your understanding of what's going on in the Middle East. Among the things we'll look at today, the story of Jordan's seismic role in the conflict that you keep hearing about between Israel and Gaza. It includes what is most likely the fastest killing ever of a large number of Palestinian people. It was carried out by Jordan. Plus, the story of a terrorist who killed Americans and is currently on the FBI's most wanted list and living life freely as a popular celebrity in Jordan. One of her American victims just died last year. There's so much to cover today that will shed light not just on the Middle East, but on the reality of the news business here in the United States. All that coming up on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. I'm Josh Lebs. This is They Stand Corrected, the podcast that fact-checks the news. If you have not yet heard part one of this two-parter, All the Queen's Lies, I encourage you to go back and listen to part one first, because I'll refer back to it today. For that matter, if you're new to the show, I encourage you to listen to this first series of episodes in order, because they build on top of each other. I talk you through a lot of the structural bias inside mainstream news, particularly when it comes to coverage of Israel and the Middle East. But in each episode, I'm also doing my best to make everything make sense to you, even if you are new to it, and I tell you where you can find out more. With each episode, I send out a newsletter. You can sign up for it, the link in the show notes, or find it through my website, joshlebs.com. It's JOSHLEVS.com. I include links and images and more information, and I answer questions. That is also the best place to support this show. It takes your support for this show to keep going. So if you can become a monthly subscriber at a super low rate right now, that would be amazing. Anyway, let's get on with this. So last week, I looked at how Joy Reid on MSNBC is super committed to democracy, but brought the queen of an authoritarian monarchy and presented her as this moral voice that we should just listen to, while she, the queen, went off on a litany of talking points against the only democracy in the Middle East, Israel. Here is another example of the kind of thing I didn't actually have room for last week. This is one of the questions that Joy asked. This one was about pro-Palestinian protests.
But we've also seen a massive crackdown on those protests in the United States. What do you make of those protests?
Yes, the perfect person to weigh in on protests in America, which involve an American democratic right, is the queen of a monarchy. Also, here's some recent sound from Reuters in Jordan. Jordan has been battling anti-Israel protesters, and of course, neither person in this interview brought that up. The Queen also made all these easily disprovable claims, including some that I couldn't get to last week, like this about when there have been talks between Israel and Palestinian leaders to create the first ever Palestinian state.
Whenever negotiations take place, the departure point is always, what will Israel accept, right? What will Israel agree to?
Hear how Joy said right in there? You know, I shouldn't have been, but even I was a little surprised to hear this exchange because it's just so blatant and shameless. The history is filled with examples of the exact opposite happening, of Israel making these offers. President Clinton said Yasser Arafat missed a golden opportunity. I'll include links about that in the show notes. And look, you can have subjective conversations about which side and which forces led to any given set of efforts falling apart. But it is a concrete fact that what the Queen said here is a lie. It's a concrete fact that the departure point is not always what Israel will accept. Meanwhile, Palestinian leaders have yet to accept the existence of Israel, a Jewish state in a tiny little stretch of land that was part of the Jewish homeland, Jewish as in the people of Judea, a place. And of course, this was not mentioned in the interview, but Palestinian governments openly pay terrorists for killing Jewish civilians, pay for slay. In America, a lot of people like to say we don't negotiate with terrorists, but then many of these same people say Israel isn't negotiating enough. It's like there's this never-ending font of hypocrisy. So that's yet another example of the kind of thing I showed last week, just this concrete, obvious falsehood. But here is an opinion that casts the issue in a certain light.
This whole narrative that we've been taught about Israel always being the victim and Palestinians, who are the occupied, always being the aggressor, is not entirely accurate.
Listen to episode 1 for a reality check on the term occupation, which does apply to a lot of lands all over the world, but probably does not apply to Gaza and the West Bank. But this idea of victimhood, when you hear it, it can sound like an opinion, like a viewpoint. That's how she feels things are framed. Now, you might recognize that that's not the case, as you can tell from all the people who actually support Hamas and the unimaginably evil October 7th massacres that Hamas carried out, because they believe that Palestinians are the ultimate victims and therefore can do literally anything they want. They can even murder and kidnap babies and slaughter families and whatever. So you can see how popular that framing is. But what if we look at facts instead of general takes on how things are framed? When you do that, here's what you find. Governments and the United Nations have specifically constructed systems based on Palestinians in particular always being treated as victims. And that is not an opinion. Here's just a little information that makes that clear. In the 20th century, hundreds of millions of people, quite possibly more than 1 billion people, lost everything. There were 2 world wars and lots of other wars. There was upheaval all over the world. There's a good chance that that happened in your family. People lost land and property and rebuilt somewhere new. And that's something that the world has come to accept, that that's just what happened, except for this one group of people who the world has somehow decided must get back what was lost generations ago. And the ultimate counterpoint is probably this. It's part of the history that you've probably never heard about that's instrumental to understanding what we're talking about. In the 20th century, there were anti-Jewish pogroms in Arab nations. And all of these Jewish people, and Jewish is one term. It's the people of Israel, the people of Zion, the Hebrews, the Israelites. But in America and some other countries generally referred to as Jewish people. So these people were chased out and lost everything. They fled to Israel, where then Arab governments tried to kill them in this war, which Israel won in 1948 and achieved its independence. The number of Jewish people in Arab nations who lost everything is way, way bigger than the number of Arab people who were living under the British mandate and lost their homes in that war. But 0 people are saying that all those Jewish people who were chased out of Arab nations have to get back their land and property. No one's saying that. No one's demanding right of return. This isn't happening. But in this one case, because Jewish people can be villainized, all of a sudden, there's a totally different set of rules. So there is this very different mentality that says, instead of building a thriving society in this land where you are, be eternally aggrieved victims. That helps explain something that Hillary Clinton talked about on The View.
Israel left Gaza in 2005 and forcibly ejected 50,000 Israelis who were living in Gaza. They left all of their infrastructure. They had a big infrastructure of greenhouses where they were supplying fruits, vegetables, flowers, etc. The Palestinians deserved to have a productive, successful economy in Gaza. Hamas came in and basically destroyed all of that and killed a lot of other Palestinians.
There is support for this kind of thing among many people in Gaza, that instead of building a society to live based on destruction and anger, but it is also true that people in Gaza who want to build a society are prevented from doing so by Hamas. This whole idea is something that a guy known as the son of Hamas talks about. His name is Mossab Hassan Youssef. He's the son of a Hamas founder. Here are two little clips of a speech he gave about learning the truth after he got out of Palestinian schooling.
We're not talking about criminals who came and stole the land. We're talking about legal migrants came under the British mandate in the past century, and they were able to develop the country so fast that they went ahead all Arab countries combined with almost no resources, because the Jewish nation believes in education. And this is their secret, and that's education. While unfortunately, the other side is inciting, teaching children hatred, teaching generations to blame with corrupt leadership that never took responsibility for anything.
I'll include a video of that in the newsletter so you can see more. Where does this way of thinking come from? It is instituted and taught, including in schools backed by the United Nations. See, here's what the UN did. The United Nations has two agencies focused on refugees. One deals with refugees all over the world. The other one deals exclusively with Palestinians. It's UNRWA, you hear it referred to as UNRWA, UN Relief and Works Agency. UNRWA-backed schools specifically teach kids this way of thinking. The United Nations, UNRWA, has been a part of the problem for a very long time. Here are two clips from a congressional hearing. The first speaker you're going to hear is Jillian Rolnick from a group called UN Watch, which follows these issues. And then you're going to hear Representative Chris Smith of Connecticut.
Our 100-page report documents how teachers in schools at this agency regularly call to murder Jews and create teaching materials that glorify terrorism and encourage martyrdom.
Hatred is taught, and it's being taught with aggressiveness every single day to the youngest of Palestinians, and that is child abuse of the worst kind, because they grow up loaded for bear to kill Jews and to end the state of Israel. They don't just come by that when they're 15. They grow into it, and UNRWA is the major conduit to that.
And that brings us to something else that Queen Rania said in the interview with Joy Reid.
There is an omnipresent, deep, almost cultural anti-Palestinian racism that exists now in Israeli society.
That's a powerful reminder of how people spouting talking points with American media have learned to often use the language of the American left. Look, what the Queen said there could sound like an opinion, and there is also racism everywhere. But what if we again take this as an opportunity to look at facts? 20% of Israel's population is made up of Arabs who vote in government and serve in military. The chairman of Israel's largest bank is an Arab Israeli. There's a great video of this young man who's Israeli Arab. His name is Yosef Haddad. He's trying to educate this young woman at a table for an awful anti-Semitic group that's called Students for Justice in Palestine that claims to stand for people like him.
I have to be honest with you. This is a brainwash. Wallahi, it's a brainwash. I can vote, I can get elected. I become the president of Israel if I want right now.
I'll include that in the newsletter too. Hey, maybe Joy should ask Queen Rania about whether the Jewish people in Arab nations like Jordan are experiencing racism. Oh, that's right. They're gone. Meanwhile, surveys over the years have found Jordan to be among the most anti-Semitic countries in the world, with the vast majority of the population believing crazy conspiracy theories about Jewish people. Also, a survey in Jordan found that 2/3 of people support the October 7th massacres. And the anti-Israel protesters I mentioned earlier, thousands of them have been out chanting to send more suicide bombers to Tel Aviv. The U.S. State Department reports that Jordanian state media have published basically all the worst anti-Semitic tropes, and the State Department points out that people in Jordan who have held high-ranking government positions end up doing these interviews in which they say all the worst things, like Jews controlling everything or only caring about money. There are tons of examples. One guy called Jews, quote, the progeny of vipers and also children of the devil. This, by the way, is a good moment to pull out and take a look at the big picture of how the media handles so many stories, because any Israeli official says something vile and bigoted, and it is a top story all over the world. But 100 or 1,000 officials in Arab nations say things that are at least as bad, often even worse, and you don't hear about it at all. Some Jewish people who tried to visit Jordan reported that they were not allowed to bring in basic Jewish religious items. If Israeli authorities did that to members of any religion, again, that would be massive news all over the world. But this stuff happens routinely in Arab and Muslim nations, and the same news agencies don't care. Joy brought up none of this, of course. None. You know what else she could have brought up at this point? Anti-Palestinian discrimination in Jordan. That could be connected to why the Queen is doing these interviews. There are these reports that the Queen's popularity has been suffering, partly because a lot of people are upset with the King and Queen and how things are going. But also some of these reports talk about anti-Palestinian discrimination. And it seems that in doing this Israel-bashing media tour, she's been boosting her own popularity at home. Maybe that's something to talk about. Tale as old as time. If people are rising up against a government, quickly push the external enemy. So ask her about that. But of course not. Then at least how about this? Talk about the racism taught to Palestinian children in schools. After all, systemic racism and the role of education are so important to Joy. Here she is talking with a guest about this kind of issue on her show once.
It's literally Republicans running on an aggressive message of erasing any contextual discussion of history to do exactly what you're doing. They're saying, no, you're not allowed to even talk about race in a way that might help young people to identify this stuff when it comes at them. They're basically saying you're not allowed to do that. You have to essentially teach dogma that it's not helpful.
Meanwhile, Queen Rania is allegedly super concerned about education. Her official website from the kingdom calls her a global voice for access to quality education for children around the world. Okay, so when she brings up racism, maybe talk to her about the racism that Palestinian kids are taught in schools. There's nothing more systemically racist in the world than teaching kids to murder Jews or members of any other group. And I'm not going to get into semantics about what is and is not racism. Race is a social construct. It's not a scientific thing. It is whatever society makes of it. The Nazi theory was based on a version of racism in which Jews were the lowest possible race. Islamist groups have a long history of close ties with Nazism. But if you want to say systemic bigotry instead of systemic racism, the point is still exactly the same. This kind of thing is supposedly super important to Joy, to MSNBC, to so much of the media. But as I pointed out last week, many mainstream news organizations and much of the progressive movement set aside all their other values in order to give Israel bashers an open mic. And this interview shows that. But it also shows something else. This interview shows how you are deprived of the chance to learn not only facts, but of the other ingredient you need to get truth: context. The big picture that could crack open your entire understanding of the region, kind of like opening a blacked out window and let the light of truth shine in. How's that for an analogy? I'll explain that. And I'll tell you about Jordan harboring a terrorist who slaughtered Americans. I'm getting asked about merch. We now have bumper stickers. I'm going to give them away to the first 50 people who either join the newsletter or give us a great review on whichever app you're listening to. Apple Podcast has reviews, so does Spotify. Just send a screenshot and you can message me through the newsletter or through the form at my website, joshlebs.com. Then give me your address and we'll get you a bumper sticker. Maybe the biggest misconception that people have about this story, that the news makes worse all the time, is the idea that this whole issue is about Israel giving land back. Here's Queen Rania in the interview.
If Israel returns to 67 borders,
Right.
That is Israel giving back land, not giving up land.
Incredible. Because if Israel were to return land that it got control over in 1967, do you know who would get that land back? Gaza would go to Egypt and the West Bank would go to Jordan because Jordan had occupied it. If you're like, what? I totally get it. That is an obvious thing to say to her in this interview, but of course it didn't happen. Here are a few basics. These days at some of these anti-Israel protests, you can see these protesters holding up signs that talk about Israel being a young country, like my grandmother is older than your state, as though somehow the age of a state has anything to do with anything. But they might as well be holding up signs that say, those of us here at this rally have no clue what we're talking about, because tons of nations are younger, including Jordan. Very short version, in the 20th century, empires fell. What's that thing, empires fall? Oh, right, that's Hamilton, which I've never seen, but clearly penetrated into America's consciousness. All right, tangent alert, back to the point. So empires fall in the 20th century and tons of nations are born, like India and Pakistan in 1947, the same year that Jewish leaders accepted a partition plan that would create Israel and an Arab state. And as I mentioned earlier, Arab leaders turned that down and then launched a war on Israel. That was 1948. The next year, another nation was born, Jordan. Full name, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Geographically, it includes a large majority of a general area that the Romans had referred to as Palestine. This is crucial. I know it gets confusing, but there's never been a nation called Palestine. It was this word for a general area that the Romans used. There's a good piece about this in the Washington Post. Here's a little clip from it.
It was Roman colonizers who changed the name of Judea to Palestine.
The Romans were actively trying to erase the Jewish connection to that land. After the Romans, other empires came through, including the Arab Islamic Empire, and still no nation called Palestine. In 1949, when Jordan was founded, it included most of that area. It's more than 4 times the size of Israel, and Jordan wanted even more land. So it went and annexed, or as some legal experts put it, occupied, a block of land west of the Jordan River. That became known as the West Bank. So, to this day, the name of that block of land is based on Jordan. Then in 1967, Arab nations, including Jordan, launched another war against Israel and lost. As part of that, Israel gained control of 2 territories, Gaza and the West Bank. And as I explained in episode 1, Jordan and Egypt don't want those lands back. Israel became the first nation to have any control over those blocks of land and to take steps for the creation of yet another Arab nation, and this one would be called Palestine. But Jordan's role in this didn't end there. It still had what's called administrative claims to the West Bank. For our purposes now, suffice it to say that Jordan still had an important role. And Jordan had, and still has, a very large Palestinian population. This part gets tricky. A lot of news agencies like to say it's a majority Palestinian nation or 2/3 Palestinian. The numbers vary wildly because of the way that people can identify, but it is a large Palestinian population. So 1967, those lands become part of Israel. A few years later, in 1970, Palestinians hijacked a bunch of airplanes. There were 5 different planes involved. 2 were out of Tel Aviv, but the other 3 had nothing to do with Israel. Palestinians managed to achieve their goal with 3 of them, which was to land in Jordan. The hijackers wanted to make demands of Jordan in exchange for releasing these hostages. 1970 might sound really old to you, but to some people, these memories are very much alive. After the October 7th terrorist attacks by Hamas last year, one of the hostages from the 1970 hijackings wrote a piece in Newsweek about how it brought back her experiences. I'll include that in the newsletter as well. In the days after the hijackers landed these planes in Jordan, the Jordanian military fought Palestinian groups.
King Hussein has appointed a select group of soldiers known as the Red Berets to spearhead attacks on refugee camps where he believes the hijack victims might be held. They have done so. A lot of the camps have been destroyed. A lot of them have been hit very badly.
That is sound from ITV, which already existed in 1970. The king referred to there is the father of the current king.
It's incredible the firepower that the Jordanian army must have had in Amman. Because as you drove along the streets, there were piles upon piles of cartridge cases and empty spent shell cases from recoilless rockets. I didn't see a single house that was not touched by shells or bullets until you got very near the airport, where the houses bore white flags and loyal flags. But in Amman itself, nearly every house was either burnt out or peppered with shells and bullets.
Ultimately, Jordan managed to push a lot of these Palestinian groups out of the country into Lebanon, which then led to warring later in Lebanon and what is often described as a state within a state in Lebanon. No one knows the death toll from the Jordanian fighting with these groups. At the time, the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, claimed that 25,000 Palestinians were killed. But today, people who follow this closely don't believe that's true. Maybe that sounds familiar. Estimates do put it at thousands within days. So that could have been the fastest killing ever of a large number of Palestinian people. That war became known as the Jordanian Civil War, or by another name, Black September. And you're about to hear why all this is so important today, especially for an interview with a queen. I said that group is named Black September. That term might sound familiar to you. If it does, it's probably because Palestinian terrorists then formed a group calling themselves Black September after their fight with Jordan. And they carried out a bunch of attacks. Their most notorious attack was the massacre of Israeli athletes at the Olympics in Munich. Here's a clip from a France 24 report last year.
The Israeli Mossad killed a dozen members of the Palestinian group called Black September, but two of the Munich terrorists are still thought to be alive, one in Jordan, the other in Lebanon.
Well, in spite of the fact that they murdered, they are still enjoying life and being with their family.
The second voice there is Annika Spitzer, whose husband Andre was among the athletes slaughtered by Palestinian terrorists in that massacre. If I were interviewing the Queen of Jordan, I'd ask her, hey, do you know anything about this terrorist who is apparently in Jordan? And if you're thinking only her husband should be asked those kinds of questions, then listen to the previous episode. Palestinian authorities, to this day, hold annual celebrations for the Munich Olympic terrorists. They celebrate terrorists who named themselves Black September after their fight with Jordan, not with Israel. This wasn't the only attack by Black September. They carried out attacks in Europe. They killed people in Athens who were waiting to board a flight to New York. They attacked the Saudi embassy in Sudan. In the decades that followed, Jordan continued to battle Palestinian terrorist groups. So Jordan knows the dangers of Palestinian terrorists and terrorism. It also is willing to harbor Palestinian terrorists. And we know this for a fact because even if the Black September terrorist is not there, there's another Palestinian terrorist who definitely is. And that brings us to the current FBI most wanted list. Last year, an American woman died after 22 years in a coma. Her name is Hannah Naffenberg. In dying, she became the 16th death from a bombing at a restaurant, a Sbarro, in Jerusalem that took place in 2001. Here's a little sound from the aftermath of that bombing from the Jerusalem Post. That bombing was part of the Intifada. When you hear protesters today saying they want more Intifada, this is exactly the kind of thing they're talking about, purposely targeting and bombing civilians. Among the dead in this attack were 7 children and a pregnant woman. 2 Palestinian groups, both Hamas and Islamic Jihad, rushed to claim responsibility. For them, this kind of thing is a badge of honor. Years later, Hamas kidnapped an Israeli soldier. And as part of their deal to give him, one person, back, Israel gave up a lot of Palestinian terrorists, including a woman who was an orchestrator of the Sbarro attack. Her name is Ahlam Ahmad al-Tamimi. She got out and she moved to Jordan. There's this disturbing video of her saying that she thought she killed 3 kids, and when she's informed that it's more, she smiles with pride. Getting out of jail in Israel and moving to Jordan did not have to be the end of her facing justice. because among the people she killed were U.S. citizens, and the U.S. has charged her. She is today on the FBI's most wanted list. Jordan has an extradition treaty with the United States, but Jordan is refusing to extradite her here to face justice. Here's Arnold Roth. He's the father of another American-Israeli victim of that attack, Malki Roth. He was interviewed on I-24.
This woman, the woman who engineered the massacre, is alive and free, living in Jordan, where she's a celebrity. It's been years like this.
She is indeed a celebrity in Jordan. So if you are an American journalist and you're interviewing the Queen of Jordan, who claims to care so much about children and women, this terrorist killed children and women, how do you not ask the Queen about this? And here is where all of this comes full circle. Why isn't Jordan extraditing her? Why isn't the United States placing more pressure on Jordan? There are reports that Israel wants the United States to ease off, to not push Jordan too hard on this, because Jordan is so significant, so influential, such an important ally to the United States, and in many ways to Israel as well. King Abdullah has refused calls to cancel Jordan's landmark 1994 peace treaty with Israel. And Jordan continues to be a top recipient of U.S. aid each year, like Israel, including military aid. And that is why a question that any U.S. journalist should ask the Queen is, well, I'll tell you right after this. So much of the media has fallen into a simplistic binary narrative of big bad Israel attacking pure innocent Palestinians. The reality is that there are so many players in this conflict. Jordan and Egypt and other nations in the region are part of the fight against Iran, which is using Hamas and Hezbollah, these Palestinian terrorist groups, as its proxies. It is a regional war with global consequences. It's a fight against Iran's efforts to create and lead a new Islamist empire. Any interview with the Queen should be an opportunity to educate you about at least some of that. Jordan knows the dangers of Palestinian terrorism, and Jordan has a big Palestinian population that it must provide for. It's in a position to understand and to make a big difference, not just through policy, but also through diplomacy. And you've got the Queen there. So ask her, you've been Queen for 25 years. Could you name 25 things you've done to help improve the situation for Palestinians and Israelis? Maybe 10? There probably are some. What are they? And also, what more could you do to use your wealth and prominence and voice to help people achieve understanding instead of fueling even more hatred in your kingdom and around the world by using media appearances to push lies? It's pathetic to have to say this, but the job of news is to hold powerful people accountable, not to give them an open mic to spew lies and talking points. If anyone at NBC News or anywhere else thinks that this is the job of news, well, hopefully they're listening, because now they stand corrected. In fact, right now, as you're listening, send this to anyone and everyone you know, yes, but also especially anyone in the news business, because a whole bunch of places are booking the Queen, and I'm not able to go through all of them like I did here at this listener's request, but I can tell you it's incredibly unlikely that anyone is fact-checking her. And speaking of listeners, a listener asked me how to get in touch with leaders of various news agencies. If you follow the newsletter, I'll start to put some of that information in there, and I'll keep building that up over time. And the listener who asked that is one of many who have joined as paid subscribers at Substack, which gives you direct access to me because you can fill out the comment section there. Also in the newsletter, you'll see links and videos and other stuff. Next week, presidential debates, the secret rules behind them that prevent you from getting the truth. I'm going to share with you a wild idea to fix them. Don't miss it. Be here. Thanks so much for listening. See you next time. Support comes from Nextiva, the largest privately held business communications company in North America. From one AI-powered communication hub, Nextiva transforms the way businesses engage with their customers. The company's commitment to amazing service and a customer-focused approach has been its cornerstone for 15 years. Discover more at nextiva.com.